Hi, everybody. This is Maureen Radin. I'm a senior manager here at Aperion. I did just want to let everyone know that today's session is being recorded. So we're going to ask that if you're a board member participant that you please turn your camera off. That will just help us with the quality of the recording so that it can be played back for future use on our website and our YouTube. So thank you for that. Certainly do feel free to, of course, chime in and ask questions either in the chat or by unmuting yourself throughout the presentation. But it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest presenter today, Karen McDonald, who is president and founder of Accurate Reserve Professionals. Karen's company provides reserve study services to, tell me if I'm wrong, Karen, but Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Washington. And
that's correct.
Before getting into the reserve business, Karen served on the community management side for many years. So she has had some experience on both sides of the industry and both sides of the table. She's a great person to work with and has a wealth of knowledge. So very happy to have her join us today to go through this training. Karen, I think everybody who is going to join is probably here, so we can go ahead and get it kicked off.
Awesome. Thank you, Maureen. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. As Maureen mentioned, I'm Karen McDonald. I'm with Accurate Reserve Professionals. I'm a former manager of about 15 years, been doing reserve studies for the last 7. So I understand both sides of the table, how reserve studies integrate with the communities that they are prepared for. And I am here today to help you understand how some of the calculations are done, the different types of reserve studies, the state requirements for reserve studies, and the effects that we're seeing from COVID. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, we have a pretty full agenda this afternoon. If you have any questions, feel free to either put them in the chat as we are going along, or at the end, you can also pop on and ask those at that time. I will typically wait to answer questions that come up in the chat until the end of the presentation. That way we can stay on task for the items that we're going to cover as part of the slides, but I will get to all of your questions at the end. Okay, so what is a reserve study? So Community Associations Institute is the main governing body for reserve studies. So we follow what's called National Reserve Study Standards that are developed by CAI. And this is their definition of a reserve study. In a nutshell, a reserve study essentially calculates a contribution that an association should contribute to reserves for expenses that don't happen on an annual basis. So it essentially annualizes expenses that don't happen annually. So your windows, roads, siding, asphalt, all of those components that you maintain, repair, and replace over time, but would significantly affect the association's operating budget if you drop that expense in only in that year that you're doing the project. So that essentially we do the reserve study to annualize those expenses. Okay, so I'm just going to touch really briefly on state requirements within the state of Oregon. So Oregon does have some pretty complete statutes about reserve studies. Annual updates are required for associations that are created on or after October 23rd of 1999. So most associations, they do their initial full study, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and then they do a site visit every 3rd year. And then update the studies in between with no site visit updates in the 2 years in between. So that's typically the cycle that most associations follow. Associations that were created prior to this date may opt in by a resolution of the board of directors. There are some provisions for study waivers within the Oregon statute, particularly applying to associations that have 2 units or less. So if you have questions about whether your association is required to do a study under statute, I recommend that you contact your legal counsel because that's more of a legal question. Governing documents may also include some additional requirements above and beyond the state requirements. So we are seeing that a lot of governing documents, especially more modern governing documents, require an association to perform a reserve study, regardless of what that state requirements are. Okay. So let's talk about the different types of reserve studies. There's 4 types under National Reserve Study Standards. The first is the full reserve study. This is the first study that your association would ever prepare. And during a full study, you have a reserve professional on site. They're going to take photographs of your reserve components, and they're going to measure and quantify everything. So for a condominium association, they're going to count windows and doors. They're going to measure the square footage of the buildings for siding and roofs. And they're going to develop a component list that shows the useful life, the remaining useful life, the approximate quantities of all of these items so that the cost can be prepared based on quantities, and then the estimated replacement cost for those items. So in theory, once you've done that full study, as long as you have confidence in the data that's included in that report in terms of the quantities, there's no need to repeat the full study process in the future. You typically can change reserve study providers, and you can carry those quantities forward and use those over and over again. So your full study is typically your most expensive reserve study product. But once it's done, you should not have to repeat that process in the future. The times that we see full studies repeated are sometimes after development. A new association that's just taken over from the developer may want to do a full study just simply to confirm that the buildings were actually constructed based on what the prior reserve studies estimated, especially if those studies were prepared off of architectural specs. Other associations may do a full study because they don't quite have confidence in the calculations that a prior reserve study prepared. So those are the reasons that we might see the full study process repeated by an association. The next type of study is called a level 2 with site visit report. And that's essentially where a site visit is again performed by the reserve study professional. But since we already have the component list that's been developed in that full study, we're just on site to essentially evaluate the condition of the association's assets and then update the association's report based on that site visit observation. So site visits performed, the study is updated based on projects that have been completed. If we notice that something looks deteriorated a little bit faster than it should have, we're going to want to adjust that within the report, that type of thing. So that's essentially the difference between the full and the with site visit study, is that we're not preparing that component list like we did in the full report. The level 3 no site visit study is typically your least expensive reserve study product. As I mentioned before, most associations do a with site visit report every 3rd year. And then in the 2 years in between, they do these no site visit reports. And that's essentially where we're updating all of the financial data in the report. So we're updating the association starting reserve balance, any projects that may have been completed. We're updating costs based on either current market, proposals that the association may have gotten, or contracts that it signed for upcoming work, that type of thing. And then we're producing a report that contains essentially all of the other data that's included in the full or the with site visit reports. It's just that no site visit was performed as part of that report. The level 4 preliminary community not yet constructed report probably doesn't apply to most of us on the call today, since I'm assuming that since you're all board members, you've all had your community turned over from the developer and everything's constructed. But the level 4 studies are done for communities that are not yet constructed or are not yet substantially enough to perform a reserve study site visit for the full reserve study. So that's where we basically work off of architectural plans and specs and prepare the study based off of that information. As I mentioned, a lot of communities opt to then repeat the full study process once they're turned over to the homeowners, just to make sure that the construction didn't actually end up differing from what the plans originally showed. So this is kind of a sample summary from a reserve study, and I'm going to run through how we achieve the different calculations because we get a lot of questions about these. There's quite a few common misconceptions about the calculations in a reserve study. So the starting reserve balance is either prepared by the client and reported to the reserve study provider, or it's calculated by the reserve study provider. There's really no preference in how the data comes about. If it's prepared by the reserve study provider, what we essentially do is we take the association's current reserve balance as of the most recent financial statement. We add in any contributions that are going to be placed into reserves between that date and the end of the year. We deduct any expenses that are expected, and that's how we calculate that reserve study starting balance. I should note that most reserve studies are prepared in advance of the budget year, simply because you need these numbers for your upcoming budget. So for example, we're working on 2023 reserve studies right now because most associations have already completed and adopted their 2022 budget. So it doesn't make sense to prepare a 2022 reserve study this far into 2022 when your budget's already done. You would do it for 2023, and then that way you have that information available when you prepare your 2023 budget this fall. The fully funded reserve balance is the number one question that we get on reserve studies. The common misconception here is that this is the amount that it would cost to replace all of the association's reserve components today, and that's actually not the case. What that number is that is the cumulative deterioration of the association's reserve assets. So to use a really simple example, let's say that a condominium association has a roof, it lasts 30 years, and it costs $30,000 to replace. The association would then save $1,000 per year in order to have $30,000 at the end of the 30 years. So with that being said, if the roof is only 4 years old, the association does not need to have that $30,000 in the bank. It only needs to have $4,000 in the bank toward that roof because it still has another 26 years to save up for that full replacement cost. So kind of in a nutshell, that $4,000 is the fully funded balance for the roof at that point. So this fully funded reserve balance number is the cumulative deterioration of all of the association's reserve components. So the study software calculates how much each asset has deteriorated based on when it will be replaced and how much it will cost, and then it adds those numbers together. So this number fluctuates quite wildly from time to time. It will go up as the association's assets age and the association needs more money, therefore, on hand to be able to replace those components. It will go down as the association does different projects, completes different things, and restarts the clock, because it no longer needs to have that money on hand because the item is new and you have the whole useful life to save back up for replacement of that component. So the fully funded reserve balance does fluctuate from report to report. The percent funded is a comparison between the starting balance and the fully funded reserve balance. It's essentially a comparison between what you have versus what you should have. And that calculates out to a percentage, which in this case is 83%. For the most part, associations that are 70% or more funded have a low risk of a special assessment. So we're always aiming for that 70% or higher number. There are certainly associations that very proactively manage their percent funded at a lower rate than that and are successful in doing that. But really, to have the lowest risk of a special assessment, you want to aim for 70% or more. The last two numbers in that upper paragraph are just kind of for comparison purposes. What we're showing here is the total surplus or deficit of reserve funding. Again, the difference between what you have and what you should have, which in this case is just under $28,000. And then we also break that down on a per unit basis, which in this case comes out to about $555. Buyers tend to really like this information when they're considering buying into a condominium and they're reviewing the reserve study, because it allows them to compare associations apples to apples. It shows them their risk of a special assessment, and then they're able to actually compare it across different associations, because as we know, different associations have different assets, different budgets, and it's very difficult to compare those. So just knowing how much on a per unit basis an association is under or overfunded on a per unit basis is very helpful to many buyers and even just homeowners in the association. So in this example, the current annual contribution rate is $16,800. That's how much this association has been contributing to reserves. Different reserve study providers will use different calculations here. They may calculate the reserve contribution rate on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis. My firm does it on an annual basis because we find that that's a little bit easier to plug into your annual budget. But just pay attention when you're looking at a reserve study to clarify whether the recommendation is monthly, quarterly, or annually, because that will affect how you plug it into your annual budget. That next paragraph there, that's starting with the 100% full funding contribution rate. These are the recommendations of the reserve study. So these are based on National Reserve Study standards. This particular study is recommending 3 contribution options. The first is the 100% full funding contribution rate, which is $20,500. The intent of that full funding rate is to achieve full funding over the 30 years of study. So the reserve study, even though we're preparing it for one budget year, it forecasts out over a 30-year period. And I have a couple of charts I'll show you in just a moment that explains that a little bit better. But basically, we're not trying to get you to 100% funded overnight. We're trying to get you there very slowly. And so that's another common misconception. Boards think that when they fund at the 100% level, all of a sudden they're going to go to 100% funded very quickly. And unless your association is already starting at a very high percent funded, that's not going to happen. It's going to be a very gradual increase to that 100% funded. At 70% funding, as I mentioned before, associations that are 70% or more funded have a low risk of a special assessment. So at 70% funding, the goal is the same, except for instead of over a 30-year period and to get to 100% funding, you're just aiming for that 70% funding line. This is a great option for associations who don't want to go to 100% funded, but they want to maintain a low risk of a special assessment. As you can see between the numbers, there's not a huge difference in the amounts that need to be contributed. So this is where this community would need to look at the 100% number of 20,500 and the 70% number of 18,750 and decide, you know what, it's not that much difference, maybe $10 a month per unit. So we can go ahead and aim for the 100% and have even a little bit more wiggle room. So that's just something that your association would want to look at internally as it's making the decision on which funding plan to follow. The baseline funding rate is also required by National Reserve Study standards. I personally don't particularly recommend that associations follow this funding plan just because it's very risky. With baseline funding, this is the absolute minimum that the association can contribute to reserves to maintain a reserve balance above zero over time. And so the risk here is that if a project happens a year or two early, if it goes even 5 or 10% over budget, the association has a really high chance of having to levy a special assessment. With that being said, we have had associations that have very successfully managed their reserves based on baseline funding. Typically, that's done because they research projects well in advance of when the project is due. That way, they don't have any surprises. But the baseline funding rate is there for you, and it's totally up to your association whether to follow that. But we do recommend that you aim for that 70 to 100% level just to reduce the risk of a special assessment. Okay, so as I mentioned, here's a couple of charts that better illustrate how the funding models work. So this is the 100% funding chart for that same association that we used in that last chart or in that last graphic. And so here you can see that they're starting at 82%, which is pretty good, well above 70%, but they're not going to achieve that 100% funding until the 30th year. So the study kind of gradually increases their percent funded over time. It actually goes down again at some points during the 30-year period as the association spends money on projects, and then it saves back up and it slowly goes up again. So that's kind of a 30-year example of the 100% chart. If we were looking at a 70% chart, it would be essentially the same data, but the percent funded would just be a little bit lower in that right-hand column, and they would be ending at 70% funded instead of 100% funded. Okay, so this is the baseline funding 30-year chart. And I wanted to throw this in because it really does illustrate the risk of why you may end up needing a special assessment on baseline funding, even though you followed your reserve study. So here, as you can see, in the year 2047, I've highlighted that the association is going to spend $316,000 on reserve projects that year, which leaves them with only $541 in the bank. So if that project, that $316,000 project, goes over by 5%, we're looking at what, $15,000? If it goes over by 10% in cost, then we're looking at $30,000. That $541 that the association was going to be left with is not going to be sufficient to cover any cost overruns. So that's why associations need to be really proactive when they're following the baseline funding plan. They need to make sure that that $316,000 estimate in the reserve study is as close to the actual cost that they can expect to incur as possible. Because again, if it goes over, there's a really high risk that the association will have to do a special assessment for the difference in cost. Okay, so we get a lot of questions about which components go into a reserve study. So we use a 4-part test under National Reserve Study standards in order to determine that. So the components have to meet all 4 of these requirements. It's not if it meets one of the requirements, it qualifies. It has to meet all 4. So the first is it has to be an association responsibility to maintain, repair, and replace. Believe it or not, we have seen associations. I just had one a couple weeks ago that maintained some wetlands that were adjacent to their association, but the wetlands were actually owned by the county. That would not qualify for reserve funding because they were maintaining an area that they did not own, nor were they responsible for. So it does come up every once in a while that an association is maintaining an asset that it's not responsible for. So first off, it has to be association responsibility. The second item is it has to have a predictable useful life. We have to know about how long on average that component lasts. And then going hand in hand with that is number 3, we have to know how much the remaining useful life is on that item as well. So we have to know that, okay, on average, asphalt lasts 30 years, for example. We know that this particular asphalt is 10 years old. So we know that it has a 20-year remaining useful life. So we have to be able to calculate that within reason. The fourth component is that it has to be significant in cost. That is typically defined as 1% or more of the annual operating budget. So if you have an association that has $50,000 annual operating budget, any expense to maintain, repair, or replace reserve components that is 1% or more, $500 or more of the annual operating budget would qualify for reserve funding. Now, it's important to kind of clarify that we really don't want to see associations diming their reserve funds. So just because something is $500 or more doesn't necessarily mean you should take it out of reserves. If you have room in your operating budget to absorb, say, a roof repair that's $600, we would recommend doing that simply because the reserve study is really meant for maintaining, repairing, and replacing major components for major costs. But again, if it does qualify under that 1% rule, you can use reserve funds for it. There's also an honorable mention here that's not really part of the National Standards 4-part test, but it really does affect reserve studies and reserve funding, is that the component or the expense, it really should not occur annually. So even let's say you have an extensive sprinkler system at your association. Every year it costs $5,000 to start that system up because you have numerous broken heads, lines are cracking over the winter, that type of thing. Because you're paying that expense annually, that should not be in your reserve study. It really just doesn't make sense to put that money into reserves and take it right back out every year. So that's where you would want to plug that number into your operating budget and treat it as an operating expense because it's happening annually, regardless of the extent of the expense. So this is kind of a sample component list for an HOA, just kind of a simple one that we've used for today's purposes. You can see that each component is assigned an asset ID. It's got a description as to the type of component and then what we're expecting of it. So for asphalt, we have 2 different components. One's for repair and seal coat. The other one's for overlaying that asphalt. And then different softwares will present this information differently. This particular software will show the useful life, and then an adjustment, and I'll talk about that momentarily, and then the remaining useful life of that component, and then the current cost in today's dollars. So what that adjustment column is we want to make sure that projects that make sense to do together or to do consecutively align in the study. So we may need to adjust the remaining useful life from time to time to make sure that they align. So a great example is asphalt repair and seal coat versus asphalt overlay. It does not make sense for the reserve study to tell you to seal coat your asphalt in 2022 and then grind it all down and overlay it in 2023. You just wasted all that money on seal coat. So we may need to adjust things from time to time to make sure that they align. The same thing applies with exterior paint versus siding replacement. We don't want to recommend that you paint a building and then replace the siding within 2 or 3 years. So that's where you'll see the adjustments occur on the different components, just making sure that things align properly. The unfunded components are typically represented in the study. You'll see in this particular association, there's just a couple of them down there at the bottom. Those are components that did not meet the 4-part National Reserve Study test for a number of reasons. Usually it's because it doesn't have a predictable useful life. or it's something that is not the association's responsibility. So here in the example of pole lights, maybe those are maintained by the utility provider. They're not the association's responsibility. But we do notate those in the study. That way somebody doesn't think that something was overlooked and that funding should have been added for a component that's not in there. Okay, so there's essentially 4 ways to pay for your reserve projects. The first and the least expensive way is regular contributions to reserves. The reason that this is the least expensive way is that you will get reserve interest income over time, which helps offset the cost of the project. So in theory, you're not actually paying the full project cost in the year that you perform it. You've actually gotten interest income over the years, although it may not be a lot, but you have some. And it helps offset the cost of that project. So you're actually paying a little bit less than the project in today's costs. It's also the most fair to owners. If you're contributing to reserves equally every year as the association's assets deteriorate, if an owner owns their unit for a year, they only pay in a year toward those reserve projects. If they live there for 25 years, they've paid in for 25 years. So that's the most fair way to spread those costs over time. The special assessment is the kind of next most expensive way to pay for reserve projects. And the reason we say that is typically you would special assess for the project cost at the time you're performing the project. So you don't have the benefit of that interest income. So you're essentially paying the exact cost of the project. Whatever it is in today's dollars, you're special assessing that and paying it. The reason that that is not the most fair option to the membership is that the owners that own their unit in the year that the special assessment is levied pay the full freight of that project. So if you're a special assessing for a roof, then whoever owns their unit that year paid for that roof, and whoever lived there the last 30 years and enjoyed the use of that roof did not actually contribute toward it. So some associations are not well funded, and their really only option is a special assessment. So if that's the case, then we just go with what we go with. But that's why regular contributions to reserves are really preferable in preparing for these expenses. The next option in terms of expensiveness is the bank loan. Associations typically, not always, but typically can obtain a bank loan for major projects. And but there is an interest expense associated with that bank loan. So that will cause your project costs to increase, sometimes substantially, depending on the amount of the loan and how long you're paying interest on that balance. But it is an option for some associations. Some associations do well with their bank loans. But again, just something to consider when you're trying to figure out how to pay for your different projects. The last option is the thing that I think that most boards and homeowners fail to think about, which is if you do nothing, there's typically a decline in property values. If you take a look at a building, the paint is peeling, the asphalt is all broken up, it's got tree roots everywhere, all sorts of problems. Typically, units within that community are not going to draw top market value as compared to a community who has maintained their reserve fund and then has maintained their buildings. They've painted when they're supposed to, they've maintained their asphalt, everything looks nice and clean, and they're not super underfunded, that type of thing. Those units will typically draw more at a market in market. So again, just something to consider. It will all come out in the end, whether you pay for it through regular contributions, special assessment, bank loan, or you do nothing. And unfortunately, your property values are affected by that. But again, reserve projects will end up being paid for. It just depends on which of the 4 ways your association ends up going with. Okay, so let's chat a little bit about the COVID effect, kind of what we've seen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's affecting associations and their reserve funding. So the good news is there's been little effect on associations' ability to fund their reserve accounts. I personally have not had a single client that has come to me and said, Karen, we cannot fund our reserve account because we have too high of delinquencies because of COVID-19, so we're not able to make our contributions. So that's the great news. Even though we've had the pandemic, for the most part, property values have remained high, people have equity in their units, and most associations are not experiencing issues with owners being delinquent on their assessments to where it's affecting their reserve funding. Some are, but not many at all. The next thing that we've seen is we did see an initial drop in interest rates on both savings accounts and the loans that associations were taking out, but we are now starting to see those increase, particularly on the loan side. We also saw little effect on an association's ability to secure loans. So that was also good news. Associations that already had projects in the hopper and needed a loan to do that when the pandemic hit back in 2020, and then thereafter have still been able to secure those loans and perform those projects, although there's been a few hiccups, which I'll talk about on the project performance side. So what we've seen on the project performance side is we've seen, and you've probably heard this, an increased materials cost and shortages. So we're getting a little bit better. Things are coming down slightly, but it's still higher than what we saw pre-pandemic, especially for lumber, which unfortunately affects a lot of associations' projects, because lumber is a big deal as part of those projects. So when we're doing siding repairs, deck repairs, that type of thing, it usually involves lumber. For a very short period, one of the architectural firms in the industry had said that they were actually trying to figure out ways to do repairs avoiding lumber or reusing lumber because of the shortage and of the extreme cost increase. But I think we're coming back down on the other side of that at least a little bit. We did see some limited contractor availability, including delays in permits and inspections when everything shut down, especially during the initial shutdown. Permits and inspections from the governmental level really got delayed by that. Again, things have started to reopen, and so we're seeing less and less of that, but there has been a little bit of a backlog on that. And then we've seen owner considerations that we really didn't have to consider before. So one of those is the noise and nuisance of performing these projects. Now that a lot of people are home during the day, working from home, doing Zoom meetings, just like we're doing today, and they really don't want somebody on the outside of their wall replacing siding, banging around, replacing their roof. Those are all really loud projects. And so that's something that we hadn't had to consider before. And it may be something that we need to consider going into the future, depending on how many people remain working from home after the pandemic ends. The other thing was unit access. Most people, or a lot of people, were not super comfortable having strangers or workers accessing their unit during the pandemic. And so we had to get creative on how can we access different areas without going directly through a unit. If we're doing decks, can we put a ladder up and climb over the railing instead of walking through the unit? What are our different options? So those are some of the things that we've seen come out of the COVID pandemic. Because of the increase, I wanted to touch on kind of how that affects the reserve study, what it looks like going forward, and what different associations should do. So what we're doing from a reserve study standpoint right now is costs are definitely higher, sometimes as much as 25 to 30% higher than pre-pandemic costs. And so for near-term projects, we are increasing the costs to current market rates because we believe that that is the rate that an association can expect to pay, at least in the near term, meaning probably the next 1, 2, 3 years. Projects that are further out down the road, obviously we need to wait and see how the project costs level out, if they do, after the pandemic officially ends. And so what we're doing is we're increasing those costs a little bit. So they're still a little bit higher than pre-pandemic costs, but we're not putting them at the costs that we're seeing in today's market, because we're hopeful that those costs will start to decline over time and kind of level out, and it won't affect the association as much as the near-term project costs are. So those are kind of how we're mitigating things. And again, as resource study providers, we're constantly tracking the market, checking costs with local vendors, architects, engineers, trying to see what everybody's seeing in the market, and then try to predict what that's going to do both in the near and long term. An association, because of the high project cost that we're seeing right now, asphalt's a great example because it's an oil product, and obviously we know gas prices are going up, oil's going up. An association may strategically postpone specific projects. If you're going to do that, we strongly recommend that you use extreme caution if you're postponing any exterior envelope work. That would be anything: windows, siding, roofs, decks. Those all rely on their weatherproofing capabilities to protect the building from hidden damages. And so if you are going to postpone any of those projects because of the current market, or because you can't get a vendor out to do the work because everybody's so busy right now, we strongly recommend performing a building envelope investigation, which is where an architect or an engineer comes out. They do intrusive testing where they're removing portions of the siding. They're looking for very specific areas where hidden damages are common, and they're trying to determine whether hidden damages exist and whether the building envelope is performing as designed. We recommend that you perform that. That way, if you have hidden damages, or you know that postponing it will cause further damage to your building, you can make alternate arrangements. We really don't want to see you arbitrarily postpone an exterior envelope project if it's going to create damage and or higher costs down the road. And then what this really kind of highlights at the end of the day is the importance of funding your reserves to 70 to 100% levels. So most associations, not all, but most, if they had been funded to 70, 100% levels, would be able to absorb the current project costs because they would have a little bit of wiggle room in their reserve funding. It's typically the associations that are poorly funded that are running into issues where they need to do a project and they don't have enough money on hand right now because the project costs more than originally projected because of the pandemic current market rates. So really that's why associations should aim for that 70 to 100% level, because the market does do things that nobody saw coming. And it's really important that associations have some wiggle room there in order to perform the projects that they need to perform. So one other current event that I just wanted to touch on, and I'm sure most of you heard about it in the news, is the Surfside, Florida tragedy where we had the condominium building collapse over there. So what this highlighted was a couple of different things that really jump-started a discussion on the national level about reserve studies. There's only a handful of states that actually have legislation that require reserve studies. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of long-term legislation changes to require them in more states. But it also highlighted what a reserve study is and is not. At the end of the day, a reserve study is a budget tool. They are not structural assessments. We are not evaluating systems like electrical systems, plumbing systems. We will ask questions about those systems, but it's not an evaluation of those different types of systems because a reserve study site visit is a limited visual review. We certainly look for red flags and we will notify the association if we see them, but you should not rely on your reserve study site visit as the end all be all for the condition of your building envelope or your building structure. So you should, if your association has concerns, fund for other periodic inspections within your report. So examples of those would be a building envelope. My firm and a number of other firms in the Pacific Northwest will often automatically fund for that for you just because they are such a good practice, a best practice. But also structural evaluations, especially related to decks. We see those quite often. Plumbing evaluations, electrical evaluations, both of those, plumbing and electric, are even more important if you're experiencing problems. It's really important to identify those early because those can be very expensive to remedy. We've also seen geotech or hydrologists needed. If there's issues on site, we've seen retaining walls that are crumbling, and the need to figure out whether there's water movement behind there, kind of what's causing that. And so if your association has a need for any of these inspections or you have concerns that you might need these, do let your reserve study provider know because they will be able to add funding to your reserve study so you have some money set aside to perform those inspections. Okay, so that kind of covers the material that I was planning on discussing today. Let's see, I see one. Oh, somebody corrected my grammar. Thank you. Donnie said that the COVID should say affect instead of with an A instead of effect with an E. I went back and forth a million times when I did my slides. So thank you for correcting that. But any other questions that I can help answer for you regarding the presentation today? You're welcome to plug them into the chat or unmute yourself and come on with your question, whatever works better for you. Perfect. Well, I guess we covered everything. I don't see any other questions here. So let me just scroll through, see if I see any hands raised.
I was going to raise my hand, Karen. I'm sorry.
Oh, please go ahead.
Michelle Hogarth from Aspen Glen. Could you please review that section about using the less than 1%, I think you said, for kind of nickel and diming repairs?
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So the 1% rule is that a reserve component goes into the reserve study if the cost to maintain, repair, or replace it exceeds 1% or more of your annual operating budget. So typically, your reserve study is just going to have mainly replacement components, so roof replacement, asphalt, grind and overlay, those types of components. They don't always include, for example, a roof replacement component and a roof repair component. So that 1% rule, it essentially says that if the association, let's say you have your $500 is your 1% threshold, and you have $1,000 roof repair bill, in theory, that would qualify for reserve funds because it meets that 1% rule. But your reserve study may not have a component for roof repair only, because roof repairs are really unpredictable, right? That 4-part test showed that we have to be able to predict things, and roof repairs are not predictable. Roof replacement is, but not roof repairs. So you can go ahead and use reserve funds if you want, but you're now taking money away from the reserve study for other reserve components that are already in the report. So that's where we don't want to see you nickel and dime your reserve study. Another kind of important note there is we don't really want to see associations spending a bunch of money on repairs that don't actually extend the useful life of something. So again, using that roof example, if that $1,000 of repairs will not extend the useful life of the roof, and the roof is already close to the end of its useful life, it may be worth considering the fact about maybe we replace that roof instead of repair it, because we're not really spending that repair money wisely. So there's quite a few things to think about there, but for the most part, your association should have a pretty decent sized maintenance line item in your annual operating budget, and it should try to absorb as much of those smaller repair costs as possible, and then only treat the larger repairs or the repairs that you're unable to pay for out of reserves as a reserve expense if they exceed that 1% rule. Hopefully that helps explain things a little bit. Let's see here. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me, Karen?
Yes, I can.
So what I'm confused about is, what is the homeowner association responsible for? So for example, we have a 59 unit development here with only a very small park and sidewalks. Is each individual owner responsible for the painting of their house and when, and yeah, or is the homeowner association responsible?
So that will vary community by community based on your specific governing documents. So as part of the reserve process, we will review your governing documents to see which items the association is responsible for versus which items an owner is responsible for. And then we will only include those association items in your reserve study. We will typically notate the owner items so that the, again, like I mentioned on those unfunded components, we don't want somebody to think that we overlook something. So for example, if you have a townhouse, but the owner is responsible for painting it, it will show up in the study and it will say that we're not funding for this because the owner is responsible for painting their townhome. So that really varies by community, and each report is then tailored based on your governing documents.
Okay, so I need to look at the governing documents.
That's correct. Yep. And that, you actually raise a great point with that, Gary, because being a former manager, I'm very sensitive to following the governing documents. We don't make assumptions that just because you have something, let's say that's a townhouse and that has an attached or a shared wall, that doesn't always mean that windows, roofs, and siding are automatically an owner responsibility or an association responsibility. There's no assumption that's made. We have to look at those governing documents, and it isn't uncommon to actually find mistakes there. So for example, it's not uncommon for some governing documents to have language that says that the association might actually perform the work. So for example, decks, the association might recoat the decks, but the cost of that work might actually be billed to the owner. And in that case, we would not fund for that. Even though the association performs the work, it doesn't pay for it. So there would be no need to include reserve funding for it because it's not paid for out of reserves. So that's where we really pay attention to those governing documents. And we do unfortunately catch errors that were done in other reserve studies and correct those as part of the study process, because there really is no way to make an assumption that each association is the same.
Okay, so we have a property manager. I guess we can have the property manager look at the governing documents and let us know.
Yep, they would be happy to help you with that. Association managers are awesome about helping you with that. And if your governing documents aren't clear, they'll help you find an attorney that can help you clarify that.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen.
Absolutely. Any other questions that I can answer? So I have a question here on the chat that says, have you experienced having an HOA turn over replacement reserve responsibilities to the individual owners, for example, in lieu of a special assessment? Yes and no. I have not seen that done as the result of trying to avoid a special assessment, because it typically requires an amendment to your governing documents, which is a very lengthy and expensive process. And so most associations either don't want to or can't get the support to do that. And so they end up performing the projects as their governing documents are written. With that being said, I have had some associations that have completely revised, we call it restating their declaration, and they've made some changes to who is responsible for things. It actually usually goes the other way. Usually it's the association taking over something that might have previously been an owner responsibility, because it makes both financial and logical sense to do so. Again, using the example of a townhome, we have seen some associations where, you know, you're totally attached units, the siding is one cohesive run, the roof is one cohesive run, but the governing documents make it the owner responsibility. And it doesn't really make sense to do that. You can't really just kind of cut down the middle of that roof and of that front wall and replace just that half or that quarter of the building. It makes more sense to do the whole thing and to have control over it to make sure that it's done right. So we actually see it go the other way, where associations may actually amend their governing documents to take over items that were previously an owner responsibility. At the end of the day, it's very rare either way. Most just end up following what's written in their governing documents originally. These are great questions. Anything else I can answer for you? Perfect. Well, I think that'll probably wrap us up then. Maureen, was there anything that you wanted to add in before we sign off for the afternoon?
Sorry, I was on mute, Karen. No, I think just thank you so much for the time today. We really appreciate everybody being here and asking good questions and being engaged. Karen, do you want to maybe pop your email address in the chat in case folks want to reach out to you directly?
Absolutely.
That might be a good thing to do. And we work with Karen's company a lot. So of course, we're glad to, if you want to get in touch with your manager and say, hey, I attended the training and I have some questions for Karen, we can connect you that way as well.
You're welcome. Anybody can call or email anytime. We're always happy to answer questions in general, whether or not you have a current reserve study with any reserve study provider, happy just to answer general questions.
Thanks so much, Karen. Thanks everybody again for attending today.
Thanks,
Thank
Mark.
you, everybody.
Have a good one, guys.